Hello, this is Carolyn Marshall, the Executive Director at Lucille Raines Residence in Indianapolis. Perhaps you're wondering what Lucille Raines Residence is, besides a building located at 947 North Pennsylvania Street. For the last 46 plus years, Lucille Raines has been a residence for persons who have completed substance abuse programs and want to live in a clean, sober environment while they deal with issues of recovery. Lucille Raines Residence has a history, and let me take the opportunity to share a bit of that history. In 1968, when the United Methodist Church was formed, bringing together 6 former conferences in the state of Indiana, as well as the other ramifications for it nationally and internationally. It brought together 3 former Methodist conferences, 2 former Evangelical United Brethren conferences, and then a part of the Lexington Conference, the segregated conference of the former Methodist Episcopal Church, which was being dissolved and becoming a part of the United Methodist Church. 6 former conferences coming into the Indiana area as 2. The women from those 6 conferences thought that there was absolutely no realistic way of bringing all of the programs of those 6 conferences together and carrying them all forward realistically. Therefore, they evaluated the missions and programs and policies of those 6 conferences to see what was really, 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 really important, the things that they should carry forward as the new conference, the new church. And it was owned and operated by what was then the women's organization, the WSCS. It was a large home, and a large 2-story home on North New Jersey Street. Very similar to a program for the YWCA, a home away from home for young women coming to the city for jobs, go to school, sober living, safe living, as these persons came from around the state. Inasmuch as the church was going to be larger, the women's organization would be larger, they felt that the thing to do was to move that from that large 2-story home on North New Jersey to something larger, and therefore they purchased what was the Nottingham Court Hotel at 947 North Pennsylvania, and then built a 2-story addition to it, moving from what would accommodate about 12 persons to a facility that had 50 rooms, 50 basically then hotel rooms. Those were made to accommodate 2 girls. It became a very, very, very thriving organization. Young women from the city, young women from the countryside, from smaller towns here in Indiana, came, lived at Raines for a period of several months to 2 or 3 years, while they got the opportunity to go to school. First jobs become established in Indianapolis. Then very suddenly, 8 years into the program, residency plummeted very, very sharply. The women had taken out a mortgage. The paper was with the Board of Missions in New York. The mortgage on the facility needed to be paid and had been paid very, very, very promptly every single month. Women of faith always, what became United Methodist Women and now United Women in Faith, have always been mission-minded. Thinking in terms of what the dollar was worth in the 60s, 68 and onward, their repayment schedule to the Board of Missions was $3,561.10 a month. pretty good money almost any time for a monthly mortgage payment, but certainly looking to God for guidance and ways in which to make it happen back then. And they did it, and did it religiously and regularly until they couldn't do it. When the income wasn't there, there was nothing to do except to close. And so on December 31st of 1976, the board voted to close, and did, leaving an unpaid mortgage, leaving people around the state of Indiana basically hanging crepe and wringing their hands and saying, what are we going to do? They received all kinds of advice from well-meaning people, mostly persons who were not involved, and mostly male individuals who felt that history had moved too far beyond them. And they really were urging that women, as they said, get back to doing things that good little church women ought to be doing. Get back into the kitchen and make chicken salad and chicken casseroles. Not wanting to admit that it was a both and rather than an either or. And so for 6 months, the building had security, but beyond that, nothing happened. There was insurance on the building, but there was no program. There was no one living there. The mortgage was not being paid. It went into arrears. And in case you're wondering, for the people who said, don't worry about it, nobody will sue the church, that nothing could be further from the truth. Nobody sued, but they certainly were capable of receiving all kinds of past due notices, and individuals wanting to know what they were supposed to do with this paper about which they had absolutely no responsibility, legal responsibility. And then God moves in mysterious ways. Enter Evelyn Saffer. Evelyn Saffer is a former nun in the Roman Catholic Church, a PhD from Fordham, Dean of Women in the college, but a person who had been touched by addiction, deep alcohol addiction. God had somehow moved in her life, and she connected at that time with the Salvation Army. Major Velasquez was with the Salvation Army here in Indianapolis at that time. And he was as much of a risk taker as Women Organized for Mission in what is now the United Methodist Church have been across many, many years, back from 1869 forward. He said that somebody had told him that if, who was not then known as Sister Marie Kathleen, happened to come in seeking his guidance, to put her on the payroll whether he could afford it or not. And he said that the day that she walked in, the bank account was overdrawn, but God told him to assimilate her into his program, and he did. And it wasn't very long until she was out writing programs, doing the things that God created her to do. She had said if only there had been kind of a program that she wrote when she needed it. There wasn't. But she wrote this program for what was called then a community involvement center, where persons who had completed treatment but needed some structure, some way of being accountable, way of living together, a way of communicating with each other, could live. And so again, God's intervention. Then United Methodist Women had an empty building. Evelyn Saffer, through the Salvation Army, had a program. And the first introduction we as United Methodist Women had to Evelyn and the program was through hunting for a building and introducing the program. Those of us who are aware that the United Methodist Church has structure, let me tell you, you can't light a structure, we can't light a structure to the Salvation Army. And getting the program together with Major Val being as much of a risk taker as Women Organized for Mission in the church have always been, and probably will always continue to be. But he still had to get permission from Major Hasney in Chicago. The only way to do that was to simply, I don't want to say lay the law down, but to put a deadline on it. Either the signed papers were received by 4 o'clock on whatever day it was, or the deal was off. And so that day, although Chicago and the headquarters for the Salvation Army had not responded, Major Val sent a driver and Evelyn to Chicago to walk the papers through the headquarters, Salvation Army headquarters, and get the proper required signature. 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock that afternoon was the deadline. 4 o'clock came and went. I had just said, well, it looks like the deal is off. When at 4:10 the doorbell rang, and there they stood, signed papers in hand, with the question, is it too late, is it too late, is it too late? Of course it wasn't too late. And so from there we went to the office and copied papers and began planning for what has become a new program. Instead of serving young women only who are coming to the city for jobs and opportunities to live in Indy, we moved into serving persons who had become undone, as Evelyn said, by their own doing. Persons who were addicts in drugs or alcohol. At that time it was mostly alcohol. Time has moved on and we end up in more people with gateway drugs into alcohol may be the gateway, but ending up into hard drugs. Lucille Raines, this building that they bought and now needed to be opened again, had 50 rooms. There were 5 residential floors with 10 rooms on each floor. At the time it was its initial program. There were 2 living to a room. There was a difference in serving different populations, and it readily became apparent that persons coming into recovery, adults, were dealing with a completely different population, and those persons needed a single room. And so we went from serving 100 people to serving 50, and now serve what we say is 49. You may be wondering how 50 becomes 49. It's really not poor math. It's the fact that this building was built in 1924. Buildings that were built then are kind of like houses that were built then. Very, very, very short of closet space. And so we ended up taking one room and making a storeroom place to begin keeping some supplies. The difference was that when the young women were coming to live here, like most college situations, they brought their own linens, towels, and all that sort of thing. Now, as we move into the other program, we felt that it needed to be a welcoming atmosphere, and so rooms are furnished. Beds are made. There's a set of towels in the bathroom. There are supplies. Just a welcoming atmosphere. In the transition from being the home for young women coming to the city and the time of desperation as the residents had to close for lack of income, but the mortgage kept accumulating. That payment of $3,561.10 a month could not be made, and the mortgage kept accruing and accruing and accruing. And desperation seemed to overtake until the time when the new program came into being and we became the Lucille Raines Residence as it is known today in recovery. People often ask, whatever happened to the mortgage? It didn't just go away. Whatever happened to it? It's wonderful to reflect on the fact that that mortgage was paid off 18 months ahead of time. All the arrearage, all of the interest, everything that had happened. And to this date, we have been debt-free. Again, praise to God. There was a time when people were accepted direct from incarceration. We no longer do that. The basic reason for that is that there's such a quantum leap in responsibility, in control. And so people need to learn some of life's skills over and over and over again. People often ask how long people stay. One of the advantages of Raines is the fact that it's an individualized program. It's not a case that people are here for a particular length of time. It's not a 6-month, 9-month program. It's a case that each person is an individual, and each person has their own needs and concerns, opportunities, and lives to live. And so when people come, they establish goals, they work toward them, we work toward evaluation of them. We ask persons to agree to stay at least a year. It doesn't mean that they're going to have to pay rent like an apartment building for a year if there's an opportunity to move on. But it means that we look at it as a time of a more permanent place to live and begin again than something very temporary. One of the things that happens at Raines is the opportunity to reestablish relationships with family. So many persons in addiction have lost that connection with children, with parents, with siblings, with extended family. And that doesn't happen overnight, and reestablishment doesn't happen overnight. We do, although we basically do not have the facility for serving families to live here, there are opportunities where children not only come for a visit on weekends, but will often spend a night or two during the week with their parents in establishing that relationship. Many times people have wondered what the average age is. And we persons here come from early 20s to senior citizens, 70 plus. But the average age, anytime we run it, runs in the lower 40s someplace, 42, 3 point something or other. We've mentioned that we accommodate men and women. And normally that runs pretty close to 50-50 as far as half and half. We don't establish it that way, it's just the way it happens to happen. Each person here now has an individual room, their own private room with a private bath, which is a real advantage. Many people just think that having their own bath is the most wonderful thing in the world, particularly women. There never is a time that you don't have somebody talking recovery in the lobby. A couple nights ago as I was leaving, I took my mail down the desk and was giving it to the desk person, and walked into a conversation where she and another resident who was sitting in the lobby there were talking about what living at Raines really means, and how they had been lots of places, but nothing had ever clicked like being here. And somebody said, one of them, I walked into the conversation just as somebody was saying, don't ever let anything happen to Lucille Raines, because I was able to put my life together here. This has done for me what no place else did. Last Friday, a person stopped in. She has 28 years clean. Got her act together here at Lucille Raines. And so remember when she has given her testimony a many times saying, I was in 16 different places before I got to Raines. And somehow, whatever it was, that supportive community, the supportive community that was an office at one time, but you have to experience it, you have to live it, you have to know what it's all about, you have to be a part of it to understand what that really means. That's what folks find here. Very recently, I was talking with the executive director at another recovery house here in Indianapolis, and her comment was, remember, I went to my first AA meeting at Lucille Raines in 1985, and has been clean ever since. Folks, the ministry that happens here at Raines, day in and day out, makes a difference in ever-widening ripples, in concentric circles, not just in Indianapolis, but in Indiana and literally around the world, as people make a difference and people give their credit to God, to Raines, to people who had the foresight and would not say no, even in the midst of adversity, even in the midst of some of the very worst of what has happened. But people who have said yes to God, because that always accomplishes His mission.